Hello and welcome back to part two of our lectures on the Greco-Persian Wars. Last time we looked at Darius' invasion of Scythia. We examined the Scythian peoples and talked a little bit about these nomadic horse cultures that are going to recur repeatedly throughout our course. Then we looked at the Ionian Enlightenment, these Greeks who lived under Persian rule in Ionia on the coast of Anatolia. And we looked at the Ionian Revolt, which had seen some of these Ionian cities rebel against Persian rule and draw Athens, who many of them saw as their mother city from which those colonies in Ionia had been founded, get drawn into the conflict and try and help them rebel against Persia. We saw that the Ionian Revolt was unsuccessful, but that the Persians were largely merciful, gaining the loyalty of many of the people and cities who had rebelled, but that also Darius, the Persian Shah, was looking to make an example of Athens for having aided in a rebellion inside his city. Now, Darius took time to gather and send an expedition. He didn't actually go himself, but he used the recently conquered beachhead in Scythia in part as a base. Darius plundered some cities that resisted, but he respected local shrines, in keeping with Persian tolerance since the time of Cyrus. Despite being outnumbered, the Athenian hoplites, who went out to defeat this relatively small expedition of Persian forces, although they would still have been outnumbered, defeated the Persian professional army at the Battle of Marathon, for a variety of reasons, some of which came down to the effectiveness of hoplite warfare, some of which was good strategy on the part of the Athenians, and some of which was Persian arrogance and poor coordination, and some of which was pure dumb luck. Now, this victory at the Battle of Marathon was major for Athens, and it went down in legend. We most often today remember it for the 25-mile run supposedly made by one of the victorious Greeks back to Athens to announce the victory over the Persians. And supposedly, he then cried out, "Nike, victory," and promptly died, as we can see in this modern 19th century painting of the event. However, Herodotus does not record this. The incident is not recorded for actually several hundred years after the Persian Wars. It's certainly made up. We know that runners could go far further than this without dying. In fact, of course, the whole point of the modern invention of this as a race, the Greeks didn't have a marathon race of 25 miles. That's in commemoration of this event that we do it in the modern period, shows us that, in fact, people can run 25 miles without killing themselves in the process. Although, keep in mind that the runner would have just fought in a major hoplite battle. You'll notice also, I know some of you out there are going, but a marathon isn't 25 miles, it's 26.2 miles. That's true today, but the actual distance from Marathon to Athens is only 25 miles. The length of the race was actually increased at the modern Olympics in 1908 in London to 26.2 miles, and it has remained the same ever since. That's not the actual distance that was run from Marathon, the Battle of Marathon, to Athens itself. So the first Persian invasion was relatively short. It was ended by one major battle, the Battle of Marathon. Well, obviously, the Persians could not let this stand either. The Athenians were effectively encouraging rebellion and standing up to the Persians for it, and indeed the new Persian Shah Xerxes, who took over when his father Darius died in 486, immediately had to put down a revolt in Egypt, then another in Babylon. Now, these weren't directly the result of Marathon, but losing is not something that an empire can afford to do for very long. The second Persian invasion of Greece under Xerxes is the more famous one, and it's certainly much larger and more significant, from 480 to 479 BCE. Xerxes went all out for this invasion. He came himself, unlike his father's first campaign. It was a much bigger deal for Persia than the first invasion that had gone so poorly. Now, Herodotus, who I keep mentioning because he provides nearly our only contemporary account of the Persian War, dramatically overestimates the Persian forces. He said there were almost 3 million, claiming that they drank rivers dry. In all likelihood, it was probably a lot closer to 100,000 men, but that would still have been enormous, even by modern military standards, much less in the ancient world. Getting them to Greece involved logistical and engineering marvels. It would have been like moving the entire population of a major city-state like Athens. Certainly, the Persian forces probably outnumbered the entire population of Attica around the city of Athens. And indeed, many Greek cities submitted to Xerxes immediately. This army was terrifying. There was a core of Persian professionals, even just the core of professionals, the elite unit in this enormous army. The immortals consisted of 10,000 warriors who would have been replaced immediately as soon as one died. That's why the unit was called the Immortals, because it never fell below 10,000. And Xerxes had drawn troops from across the Persian Empire. Remember those depictions his father Darius had made at Persepolis of everybody coming to and participating in the work of the great king. That would have also included Ionian Greeks, many of whom had remained loyal, having seen the folly of rebellion firsthand, and Greeks in the mainland also submitted to Xerxes when he demanded their obedience. Some of them major Greek cities like Thebes. So this is not really a great war of East versus West or Greeks versus everyone else that it's sometimes portrayed as in modern sources. In modern interpretations of this past event. The Greeks fighting with Athens called this going over to the Persians Medizing. That is, going over to the Medes or Persians. Remember, the Greeks didn't seem to always make a clear distinction between the Medes and Persians. I talked about the distinction that we now understand much better in our lecture on the Persians several lectures ago. The point to emphasize here is that Greece was not united against the Persians. Many Greeks fought on the side of the Persians. So many cities Medized, in fact, that Xerxes took half of Greece without a fight in 480. But Sparta and Athens led a coalition of 30 cities in resistance, and they chose a narrow pass called Thermopylae, which means the hot gates, where the Persians could only fight across a narrow space, negating their numerical advantage. And 7,000 Greeks held that 60 to 90-foot gap between the cliffs and the sea at Thermopylae, led by a force of 300 Spartans. They failed as the Persians found another pass around the Greeks and surrounded them, killing them all and taking the last defensible position before reaching Athens. It was not, as Hollywood has portrayed it on several occasions, just the 300 Spartans alone. A sea battle nearby Thermopylae went better for the Greeks, but with their loss at Thermopylae, they had to withdraw from the Persian navy. The Athenians abandoned their polis. They abandoned Athens in the face of the Persian advance. They evacuated to a nearby island, and Xerxes torched the city of Athens while the fleeing Athenians watched. And that was an enormous sacrifice for the Athenians. There was no precedent of a polis surviving the physical destruction of its city. The Athenians had now shown that the polis was as much an idea and the people who believed in it as the actual city itself. Still, as the refugees watched their city burn, they could have had little expectation that they would ever return and rebuild. They were refugees living on hope. But then Xerxes made a strategic blunder. Rather than invade the Peloponnese and finish off Sparta, Xerxes had his fleet attack the Greek fleet at Salamis, near Athens, where the Persians were utterly defeated by the Greek fleet, organized by the surviving Athenians. Without naval support, Xerxes himself withdrew back to Persia, leaving only a part of his army behind to support the Medizing Greeks. This remnant of the Persian army was eventually defeated by Athens and Sparta in 479 BCE. The victorious Greeks were so confident that they subsequently sent forces to attack and liberate, as they saw it, their Ionian Greek cousins, taking the war to Persia itself. But what are we to make of the aftermath of these Persian invasions? The Persians never again invaded Greece, but it's important to realize that the Greeks in 479 BCE did not know that. They expected a third invasion could arrive at any moment, and they were terrified. Athens rebuilt and became the head of a vast alliance called the Delian League to prepare and upkeep a navy that could oppose future Persian invasions, but in the process began to act something like an imperial power itself over the other members of the League, demanding taxes like protection money, while holding the fear of Persia over its allies, and using this huge fleet to exert power over other Greeks even more than the Persians had. Sometimes a distant ruler can actually be preferable to a near one. The Athenians did take the fight to the Persians seriously, at least at first, helping out a rebellion even in Egypt. But this ultimately failed, and around 450, the Persians and Athenians even signed a treaty, with Athens agreeing to stop harassing the Persians if the Persians would give the Ionian cities to Athens. Although they'd actually taken most of them, the Persians agreed to leave them in Athenian control. Note, not to give them independence, no, but to Athens's control. But even before the end of the Persian invasions, the Spartans and Athenians were already beginning to quarrel, and increasingly over the following decades, as the Spartans watched the Delian League become an Athenian empire, they started to think of Athens as a threat to Greek liberty. This eventually led to a war between these two great cities, these two greatest of the polis, in what came to be called the Peloponnesian War, but that's something that we're going to look at next time. The Persians themselves quickly realized that diplomacy was better than warfare. Greece was simply too far away to effectively conquer from Persia. There were limits to how much territory they could govern given the technology and bureaucracy available at the time. And it was much easier to bankroll the Spartans to attack the Athenians or otherwise meddle in Greek internal politics to keep Greece divided. Persian aid turned out to be an essential factor for Spartan victory at the end of the Peloponnesian War against Athens, as we'll see next time. Keeping the Greeks busy fighting each other was a much better strategy than invasion for the Persians. But the Greeks by this point were permanently a factor in Persian affairs anyway. They had proven how effective their hoplites and phalanx tactics were, and the Persians noticed. And Greek hoplite mercenaries formed the core of many Persian armies going forward. For instance, during a civil war for the Persian throne after the death of one of the Shahs in 405 BCE, the pretender to the throne hired 10,000 Greek hoplite mercenaries to fight with his brother who had inherited the rule of the Persian Empire. Now, in the final battle, which took place near Babylon, the pretender died, but the Greek mercenaries won, which was, of course, quite awkward. Well, rather than surrender to the Persian Shah that they had been fighting against, the Greek mercenaries marched all the way back to Greece from Babylon, hundreds of miles, without the Persians being able to stop them. As a result, the Western satrapies increasingly hired Greek mercenaries in their periodic rebellions against Central Persian control, while the Greeks learned how they might overthrow the Persian Empire by direct experience in these internal Persian conflicts. But the Greeks continued to fight amongst themselves, making the kind of unified action it would take to effectively defeat Persia impossible. It would take another outside force to unite the Greeks against Persia, namely the Macedonian kings Philip and Alexander the Great, as we shall see in 2 lectures. But despite the repeated failures to conquer Greece and Greeks and Persians both meddling in each other's domestic affairs, the Persian Empire survived and thrived for 150 years after Xerxes' failed invasion. And that's an important point. Persia eventually even recovered Ionia peacefully by negotiating with Sparta after the Peloponnesian War. That was a great humiliation for Sparta, who, as I've already implied, and as we shall see next time, called themselves the champions of Greek freedom against Athenian tyranny during that war. Resisting the might of Persia had become central to the Greek sense of identity by this point, contrasting the freedom of the Greek polis with what the Greeks dismissed as Oriental tyranny, even though this wasn't really accurate to the way the Persians actually governed themselves. But Greece was not that terribly important to Persia. Annoying, certainly, but not threatening, at least not for a long, long time. The Persian Empire was enormous, effective, and enduring. But the Greeks, and especially the Athenians, despite all their fear of the Persians, continued to be deeply influenced by Persian culture. For some time after the invasions, the Athenians mimicked Persian styles of dress and other items of taste, even raising pet peacocks and using parasols among the wealthy elites, both importations from Persian customs. Some scholars have even argued that the great architectural achievements of the Golden Age of Athens that we'll be looking at in our next lecture, including the world-famous Parthenon, owe more than a little inspiration to the Persian styles like the carvings we saw at Persepolis. Well, with this discussion of the Greco-Persian Wars, the first and second invasions of Greece by Persia, and the long-term aftermath that we need to consider in the context of these Greco-Persian Wars, we'll wrap up this lecture now, and next time we'll look more specifically at the examples of how Athens and Sparta represented 2 very different kinds of Greek city-states, and why and how they went to war with each other, as we've already begun to talk about this time.